Hello there, Matt Petrowski here. I'd like to welcome you to this video. I am the editor-in-chief at ISO FileMaker Magazine, and in today's video, what we're going to be taking a look at, let me switch the video here. We're going to be taking a look, this is lesson 5 in our series, and we are going to be taking a look at FileMaker's Manage Security. Now, this is a beginner series for FileMaker, and the one thing I want to impress upon you is that there is so much in FileMaker that I can't really cover everything, but I'm doing my best to get through whatever I can in a half hour, give you some nuggets, things that you can work with, and that's what we're doing with Manage Security. So let's switch over to my desktop here. All right, there we go. I already have the invoices system loaded here on my computer. If you do not have this and you'd like to follow along, here is the quick way to actually get this going. Go up to the File menu, and then you're going to find this menu right here of Get Started, and I'm working in a copy of FileMaker 16. So when you choose that Get Started, this dialog may come up or something similar. You may be working with an earlier version of FileMaker, and you'll probably get a dialog that looks like this if it's 14, 15, etc. Choose Invoices and then create that on your desktop or wherever you'd like, and then we'll be able to follow along. So let me go back and open up my recent. And what we are going to be taking a look at today, as I mentioned, is Manage Security. Now, in the previous videos in this series, I've already gone through and given an introduction to, and we're just looking at the environment here. We're not even creating a file until we get familiar with FileMaker's environment. And that's my whole intention with this series. You got to be used to and familiar with your tools in order to actually use them. So we haven't even created any fields, gone through FileMaker's calculations, etc. I've explained that the top 5 areas here are the areas that you'll probably access the most. Database, layouts, and scripts being the top 3 out of those. But security and value lists is sort of critical when you're building your database, but security, I sort of get the impression that this is one of the last areas that people use when they're learning FileMaker, primarily because they want to get into the system, start building things, and then security sort of comes as an afterthought. Well, rather than treating it as the afterthought, I'm going through it right now. So this is where we're going to access things, Manage Security. Now, the first thing that's going to come up that we're going to see here is the security alert. And when FileMaker, when you initially install it as a beginner, FileMaker has tried to make things which are somewhat complex in FileMaker a little bit easier, and they did that by just putting on a pretty interface in front of all of the complexity. Well, as a FileMaker beginner and eventually intermediate and then advanced, we don't want the simplicity that FileMaker puts in to mask all of the difficult stuff that we actually need to know. Now you can see that we've got a full access account that does not have a password. Any new FileMaker file that you create, FileMaker does this thing where they sort of want things to be easy, but it's not necessarily secure. And that's what they're giving this dialog for right here, is the very first time that you create a FileMaker file, it almost always has the name, the account name of admin, and then it has no password, and it grants you access to what's known as a privilege set that's full access. They also have one other account that they create by default, and that is the guest account, and you can see that it's not actually turned on. You would have to check this in order to turn it on. Now, this simplicity is really nice and all, but it really doesn't speak to what we need to know if we're going to develop a full-fledged FileMaker system. So let's go through the areas of this in what FileMaker calls the simple view, then we'll look at the detailed view. Now, first off, you can see down here at the bottom that there is this button that says Use Detailed Setup. This is what a lot of old-time FileMaker developers are used to. It's the only dialog that ever existed prior to this new pretty interface. New account, pretty easy to get. Duplicate button, I don't need to explain that to you. Delete button, that too. What we're looking at right here is this area over here. What happens, and first we need to explain what is authentication, because when we hold on this, we're going to see a couple of options. Only in FileMaker 16 and higher did these latter 3 actually become available. And let's go through them so that we're aware of how things work. First off, the easiest way to manage your security is the first option that it defaults to FileMaker file. In other words, within this FileMaker file, you are going to put all of the usernames and passwords that people can use to access the file. You have full control within the FileMaker file, but down the road there comes a problem where if you are going to start to use multiple files together, and you can interconnect multiple files with FileMaker, if you're going to use those multiple files, you have to replicate all of the same usernames and passwords into each of the multiple files. So let's say you have 5 FileMaker files connected together. And we'll get to why this is advantageous in later videos. It's primarily because you can distribute data or offload data from one file that maybe is used heavily and put it into another file. You can even put different files on different FileMaker servers in order to offload load. And this really comes on later down in the road where you have to plan out your deployment strategy. But this notion that you have to put all of these same username accounts and passwords in multiple files becomes a bit of a hassle. So the solution to that is the next option, which is an external server authentication. What this means is FileMaker is going to be using some of these other technologies in order to authenticate who the user is. Now, authentication in the realm of FileMaker is simply a matter of how do I know that you are who you are saying you are? And that's pretty much what it is. And usually there's a third party that authenticates that. In a lot of our other systems, or I shouldn't say a third party, but the system itself takes care of that authentication by saying the password that you have, does it actually match what I show that you have? And they use a hash and all kinds of different terms that you'll hear within that. But here in an external server authentication, what happens is when a FileMaker database is opened, it goes to the actual operating system, and on Windows, it's Active Directory. But it can also authenticate to the actual user accounts on the operating system. I can't get into this too far in depth because I want to make sure that we get through the dialogue. But suffice it to say, this external server authentication happens through FileMaker Server. In other words, you have to have a copy of FileMaker Server, have it set up to interact with Active Directory or with the local operating system where FileMaker Server is installed. That actually says, okay, I've got a person coming in, they say their name is Bob, they have this password. Does that actually check out? FileMaker Server in turn hands that off to Active Directory, and Active Directory responds back and says, yeah, Bob has the right password, go ahead and let him into the FileMaker file. With the FileMaker file server authentication, the file itself does the actual authentication. FileMaker Server just looks at the file, says, is Bob who Bob says he is because he's got the right password? And the file says yes and gives him access. Now, these latter 3 were added in FileMaker 16. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Azure. Now, all of these are your third-party authentications. This is where FileMaker Server, and again, everything beyond the first option all requires FileMaker Server. FileMaker itself can actually host files. We'll get to this in another video, but you can have other people connect to a FileMaker file that's on your computer. It's what's called peer-to-peer sharing, and we'll get to that in the sharing portion of this series. But these latter 3 are actually going to say, I'm going to FileMaker Server, when Bob tries to sign in, says, okay, I'm supposed to check with Amazon. It goes over to Amazon and says, hey, Amazon, this person is Bob? Do they have the password that they say is the right password? It comes back and it either says yes or no and then lets them into the FileMaker file. So that's how authentication works. And it's all predicated on, obviously, what we have right here, our user and our account name and our password. Now, by default, FileMaker sets up with no password. It makes things easy for you, but you definitely want to put a password on. This option of require a password change on next sign-in. This is really great to do because what you can do is you can create in FileMaker a system similar to all the other systems you use, Gmail, Google, what have you. When you create a new account, there are 2 ways that you can handle this. You can give the user a password that they use in order to log in, and you send that user the first time, and what you do is the very first time that they log in, with this checked, it prompts them to actually add or create a new password. In other words, getting rid of the temporary one that maybe you emailed them and somehow became insecure, and asks them, hey, why don't you input a new password? And that's where the user is going to input something that they actually will probably remember. So the next big area, and I don't think I need to explain changing passwords to you. And by the way, remember in the very first video what I said, if you've not watched it, you can go back. FileMaker and its whole environment is nothing more than an automation environment of everything that you find in the menus and many times in the dialogues. So if you want to create your own system where in the layout, the design that you create, you click a button and the user can actually create a new account, let's say an admin person can create a new account, send out an email of that account with the password, etc., that can be scripted. So here is the primary area of where you control what people can do. It boils down to this one topic or notion of privilege sets. Privilege sets is just simply a set of privileges that determine what the user can and can't do. Now, FileMaker by default, all FileMaker files come with 3 of these pre-made for you, and you cannot get rid of them. And they are all indicated by the brackets that are on either side of these. In fact, a lot of the areas in FileMaker have these brackets, which means they are FileMaker enforced or controlled, I should say, and you get to optionally use them or not. You don't have to. The one that you do have to use by absolute means is full access. Somebody has to have full access to the file in order to work on it. So be very careful with regards to how many people and who you give these out to. Make sure that you trust them because as it states, full access means it has full access. Now you can deactivate an account that has a full access privilege set, but the full access is basically the only way that you get in to develop with FileMaker. Personally, I have never used the data entry only nor the read only access, and I use them only as a reference, in other words, in order to learn what FileMaker can do with regards to privilege sets. Now we can create a new privilege set here. We can also click Edit to edit a privilege set, and you will be able to edit these FileMaker controlled sets. For example, I can edit the full access. When I click this, I will have the privilege set dialog that will come up. Let's scroll this back a little bit, and I will be able to edit it with regards to the services, but I will not be able to edit it with regards to the control of what can be done within FileMaker. You can see that everything is gray here in terms of what I can control. I can't click or check any of these boxes, but I can, down here, modify this topic of extended privileges. Now I want you to think of extended privileges more or less as services. What services does this particular FileMaker file want to serve up or offer to those who are going to be able to connect to it? And we're going to look at the extended privileges really quickly coming up here. So I'm going to cancel out of that dialog, and I'm going to click on this button right here of the Use Detailed Setup, because this is the one button. Let's go ahead and cancel any of my changes. Use Detailed Setup. Oh, go ahead and save and continue FileMaker. All right. This is the dialog that most FileMaker developers going all the way back to the days of FileMaker 2 when I started have been used to. And FileMaker put the pretty face on because this was a little bit difficult to understand, but we're going to walk through it. First off, you have accounts. We explained that that's your username, password. Then you have your privilege sets and extended privileges. This is where users have a little bit of difficulty determining what's the difference between a privilege set and extended privilege. I've heard about security, and where does roles factor in? Well, a privilege set is more or less equivalent to a role. For example, if you have a manager, their role allows them to do more than, let's say, the role of a data entry person. So I tend to think of privilege sets in terms of roles, in terms of what you're going to allow a person to do within the database. Now, I want to get into something that you're going to be able to implement, which is very common in FileMaker, and we're going to go through the scenario. I should have the time to do that. Once we get through this little section, we'll be able to add something to the database that you're probably going to be interested in doing. So here we have all of our same privilege sets that FileMaker has by default. We can see a list of the active accounts. We can also give ourselves a description. Now this becomes really handy when you start to end up with a lot of roles or privilege sets, if you will. Now, new, edit, delete, I don't need to explain those. Down here, just like we looked at when we looked at the manage database and the manage layouts, we do have a view by where we are able to control whether it's creation order, name, custom order, etc. So we are going to get into the details of a privilege set and extended privileges, but before we do that, I'm going to cover this fourth area of file access. Now, FileMaker has a history of being a very easy to use database system, but along with that came as the internet evolved and we got more and more people who knew how to hack and how to get into systems and do things, it exposed FileMaker to some potential security issues. FileMaker, when you are connecting more than one file to each other, it becomes possible to sort of open a file in the background. And that's by virtue of actually creating a relationship to that file and simply showing something where something in that file should actually present itself in another file. So this created a security hole. And I don't know why they haven't checked this by default, but any FileMaker file that you are working on, one of the first things you want to do is go to this file access area and check this box. Require full access privileges to use references to this file. So these references are basically when you would create a second FileMaker file and you would say, I want this second file to connect to the first file. And if this box is not checked, what happens is FileMaker basically sort of allows that secondary file to just go ahead and connect to the first file. That's the security hole where you probably want to make sure that when the second file is going to connect to the first file, it has to be done through a full access privilege account first in order to say, yes, this is okay. So go ahead and check that. You will have a list of the files that are authorized to access this file. And at any time, if you need to, you can click this button of deauthorize in order to say, I'm going to revoke your permissions of being able to access this FileMaker file. And then we've got the reset all as well. Normally, this authorize button, you don't actually have to click this and go into it. This is when you're actually linking up the other file. But many times when you've already created the relationship in the relationship graph, the first time that one file attempts to connect to another file, the authorization dialog will come up. So this isn't something that you actually have to always think about in terms of as you're developing your security. So let's look at privilege sets. This is the core of what's going on. In fact, if you're working with FileMaker Security, I really only want you to think about the two things. I've got accounts, and then I have privilege sets. And those are the two predominant things that control what users can do within FileMaker. So I'm going to create a new privilege set, and I'm just going to call it something like managers. In fact, creating privilege sets with names that are similar to your roles sort of helps out in terms of the understanding. A higher level of access than data entry. Let's say that. So this one dialog is where you get to control everything about what people can do within your FileMaker database. And it all boils down to the major areas, and that are these: records, layouts, value lists, and then scripts. Now, scripts are your automation. Can this user click this button and that button will do this, this, and this? Maybe it walks through all of the invoices and applies a new due date to them. Well, if only managers should do that, maybe you want to control access to that script. The core of your data protection is in this first one of the records. If there's anything that you want to protect with regards to what's in a field or what's on a given record, or basically who created a given record, it's here. If you want to control the ability to view that information, then you're going to be able to do it on layouts. Now you can see here that all of them start with no access. When we select this, FileMaker gives us some defaults. Those defaults are create, edit, and delete, create and edit, and then view only in all tables. So all of these are pretty convenient, but as your system grows, if you find that you need to have an even more granular degree of control, this is where you need to go. Custom privileges. Now we haven't even, as a beginner series, we haven't even looked at FileMaker's calculation dialog box, and we're going to be looking at that when we go through our fields. But I'll open this up quickly so that we can take a look at how it works. These are what, in the rest of the database world, you will hear the word CRUD, or it stands for create, revise, I don't know, create, I forget what, you'll have to look it up on Wikipedia, but it's C is create, the U is update, and I believe the D is delete. I haven't taken the time to memorize it, but it's the same thing as what we have here with FileMaker. Can the user view this? Can the user edit this? Can the user create it, or can they delete it? And then when it comes to specific fields, can they actually see or work with specific fields? So let's take a look for an example at the invoices table. Down here we have set privileges. Can they view invoices? Yes, they can. Can they edit privileges? No or yes, they can't. Now here's where we're going to learn that little trick that a lot of people want to be able to do. One of the most common things that developers want to do or want to learn to do is, how can I make it so that in my company, everybody can see everybody else's records, but only the sales rep who created a given record can edit that record? This is where you get into this area of limited. This limited, when you choose it, is going to bring up FileMaker's predominant FileMaker calculation dialog box. Now again, as beginner series, we haven't gotten into this, but this is the core of FileMaker. FileMaker is nothing more than an automation system for what you find in the menus and dialogues, and it's a calculation system where you can calculate things out. And you calculate things out based on the environment and based on whatever it is that your solution is trying to solve. Now I'm going to give you a really quick little item here. We are going to say get account name is equal to, and then we would have to point to a field. Now in this particular database, I happen to know that FileMaker does not have a created by field. In the invoices table, normally you would expect to put in most of your FileMaker systems some type of field that says who created this record, what's the timestamp, and I want to be able to say that only the person who created that record is the person that can edit it. And you can control the view as well. And this applies to most of those areas down at the bottom. But I'm going to quickly go into Manage Database. Let's see if I can actually do it right here. I can. This is one of the nice things about FileMaker is typically they give you access to other areas so that I don't have to dismiss those dialogues, back out of them, and then come back. So here I can put a created by. So if you want to follow along, I'm just going to create a created by field. Now we haven't again taken a look at fields, but I'm going to leave this as a text field. I'll click the create button, and I'm going to need to click the options for this particular field. Now again, we haven't gotten into this, and we will be, but I'm simply going to choose one of FileMaker's simple options. I'm going to say I want the creation of the account name in this particular field, and I'm going to say OK. I'm going to say OK on this dialog box, and it's going to put me right back into the calculation that is controlling that limited by. And there is my field right there, created by. So this is how simple, this is the degree of complexity. We're not going to go any more complex than this, but this is the key to how you can make it so that a given user using a privilege set, a la a role of manager, well in this case you might want to give it to your data entry reps, but this is what the calculation is saying within the security privileges. If the created by is equal to the get account name, and the get account name is the name that is used when the user is logged into the system. So if Bob, in our scenario we've been using, has logged into the system, if the record, when it was created, was auto-entered the name of Bob, and the current account name equals Bob, Bob is going to be able to edit this particular record, but no other users are going to be able to edit the record. And account names are, they are unique. You can't have multiple Bobs, obviously. So you have to think about your usernames. You can use the whole first name dot last name or the last name dot first initial. If you just go for Bob in your company and you have multiple Bobs, you're going to have a problem. So you're going to need to come up with a better system than just the first name. I'm using that for the sake of simplicity. But when we say OK now, what we have is we have a scenario that on the invoices table, and it's the invoices table alone. I would have to do this for all of the other tables if I want to control to this degree, you know, whether Bob only can edit his records on the invoices data, on the customers table, on the products table, and that's actually a real hassle. It's unfortunate that they don't have a system where you can apply multiple. I've never actually tried it. See, I don't get that. You would hope that FileMaker's ability in the rest of the area, for example, scripts and layouts, where we took a look at being able to select multiple and do bulk actions, you would hope that we'd be able to select all the tables that we want, choose the pop-up of limited, and then do that. But alas, we cannot. We have to go here and we have to manually do it each time. Now, one thing that's cool here, you notice that FileMaker is pretty smart. It won't let me select edit here unless I actually give view permissions, because it doesn't make sense. If the user can't even view the data, why would I allow them to edit the data? So as soon as I turn on yes, then the limited becomes available and I would be able to do the same thing. Now, in that regard, you would simply just copy what you had in the previous dialog, come to this dialog, and paste it. But you can get really complex in your system. I'm going to put in something here pretty quickly. Let's say not account extended account name is what I want, equals, and we'll put in on invoice data. We don't have an actual created by for the invoice data. We would have to do that. We could go through a relationship. You can get super complex, but my point here is that you can create super complex calculations with regards to controlling access. FileMaker has these operators called and we'll use this one just for grins because it might be a good example. So we'll presume right here that we actually have a field name of created by. We'll pretend. Look at this calculation and think about this. This is pretty cool. On a particular invoice, and we're thinking about this manager role, I could say if the account name of the current logged in user equals whoever created that, and the amount of the invoice data is greater than 500, then this person can edit this particular record. And that's really cool, because you think about this, you can now apply any type of conditions with regards to who can do what in your security system within your data. If you only want managers to edit invoices where an amount of greater than 500 exists, you can do that because it's completely controlled by the calculation. So hopefully that helps you out with understanding. There's a lot more that goes in here, but for the most part, that's the core of how it works. When you get to each of these menus, if it doesn't have the limited, then it doesn't really make sense. And in this case, it doesn't. A user is able either to create a record or they are not. A user is able to delete a record, or it can be based on a condition. Now, when it comes to field access, and we select this one, here's where we go down to the finest level of detail for FileMaker. If you go to all, that means that they have all field access on that particular record. And here, it wouldn't actually make sense for me to set up, yes, they can view it, only managers can do it, but they have no field access. So that FileMaker actually allows me to do something that's actually not very smart here. So I would either need to give them all access to all fields, or I would actually need to give them limited access. Now, when I when I select limited access, this is where I can see each and every one of my fields. And when I select one, you have these three options of whether they can view it only, whether they have no access to that one particular field, or whether it's modifiable. Now, here's what I suggest with regards to this. What happens is you can go down a rabbit hole where you try to get so detailed with your privilege sets and specific fields being accessible by one role and others by not. It gets to be a nightmare, in all honesty, and managing it can become a little bit of a hassle. So there's a rule in the world of security, if I could speak here, that basically says you want to start a user or a role out with the minimal level of access of what they need to, and then as that role progresses through the development, you increase what they can access. So if you want to take that approach, you would go in here and you would basically start to develop your system, and you would leave this set to none, which quite honestly, it's a hassle to do. But if you are worried about security, you would only, as you develop for that role, come in and give access on a field-by-field basis. Also, here's a key point to note. Look at what happens when I make a selection where I choose all and then I choose limited. Notice that all of the fields by default are set to modifiable. Watch what happens when I set it to none and then choose limited. all of the fields are set to no access. So there's a distinction here. If I want to start with a less permissive system, I can set it to none, then go to limited, then go start to select which fields can be modifiable. Otherwise, if I want to work in the reverse order, I can select none, then go to limited, then start to actually turn on which fields should not have access if all of them are modifiable. Now, I can tell you, as a matter of having developed for 20 years, in full access, you're sort of just developing the system, and you develop it with full wide open access. And that's a very easy thing to do. But if you don't start to plan out your roles and start to test those as develop, trust me, you will not like going back after the fact and trying to apply your security and privilege systems after you've built this major system with all of these different fields and all kinds of stuff. You sort of have to think about it as you go, and it's a good way to do things. Now, we'll talk about how you can do this when you're developing, creating a script that will allow you to easily log in and switch or masquerade, if you will, as a different role as you're developing. That will be for another video because we're at 11:30 right now, probably about 30 minutes. And I think I've covered this to the extent that I want to, and we'll be able to get to questions. There's just one final area of the privileges. I will let these options stand for themselves, knowing that you can actually read them. Okay, can this role allow printing, exporting, manage extended privileges? I've never checked that one on. Allow user to override data validation warnings. This one will make sense. It is a privilege setting that applies to field settings that say whether or not data is valid. So for example, when somebody's entering a phone number, if you require them to enter in 7 digits, and the field is not valid until they have 7 digits, this option on a privilege set will say, can this user actually click a box that says, you know, I've entered 6, it's okay, I mean to do that. This is when you would check this box. Otherwise, they can override that. Now, disconnect user from server when idle. That's pretty obvious. If the user goes for a certain period of time, and I believe you control that on server, it would kick them off. And this has to do with FileMaker's connections and how they manage that. Allow a user to modify their own password, and you can also enforce password rules, such as having to change the password after every X days, requiring a minimum length. And then one of the most important things in this little other privileges area, you'll hit this snafu in your FileMaker development time over and over. It comes down to the menu commands. The menu bar that's up on the top of FileMaker really controls what a user can and can't do. And if a privilege set is being used when a user logs into the system and they have minimum, but they don't have editing, you may get some privileges warnings when you're writing your scripts and you don't really understand why. A lot of the times it boils down to this particular setting of whether or not they have access to those menus. Remember, FileMaker is an automation system for everything that you can do in the menus. If the menus aren't there, then the user won't be able to do it. So typically I select all on most all of my privileges. It's only when I'm going to create a privilege that I know that I only want to set them to editing or I want them to have minimal. Those are the fewer times. Most of the time you want to set that to all. So here's the last area, and I'm going to go just a little bit over in terms of the security dialog, and I think I will have covered it to the extent that I want to. Extended privileges. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that extended privileges roughly means what services is this file going to offer. Now, all of these checkboxes that you can check right here are the services that are possible for this file. So let's go through some of them. For this file, for this particular privilege set, or role, if you will, should a user or should anybody be able to access the data in this file via ODBC or JDBC? If that's the case, then you check this box. Now, if you're using FileMaker Pro or FileMaker Client or FileMaker Go, I don't know why this is unchecked, but I can probably guess why. FileMaker wants you to create roles based on who's going to access it, how they're going to access it, and what they're going to do. But if you want to be able to access this particular file, invoices, when you host it on FileMaker Server, this has to be checked. just in order to access it with FileMaker Pro. And you might hit this snafu. If you don't have this checked on a particular privilege set and a user tries to log in and you're thinking, hey, I created the account, I gave them a password, it's an active account, why can't they log in? It might be because of this reason. If the privilege set that's associated to that account does not say that they can even log in with FileMaker Pro or the FM app, that's why. It's that simple little checkbox. That service hasn't been checked for the privilege set associated to that particular account. The reauthentication is something that happens on mobile. This is a mobile-only setting, and it deals with after X amount of time, does the FileMaker Mobile on FileMaker Go actually kick the user out and then force them to enter in their credentials. XML, PHP, WebDirect, these are all external services. And one thing I will say, from a developer perspective, I don't commingle my privilege sets. If I'm writing a PHP script that's going to be able to access FileMaker, I create a separate account with a separate privilege set, and that privilege set will have access PHP. Rarely in my development will you see where I will have a privilege set which will have multiple services checked. I will not create a privilege set that will have FileMaker Network and PHP, because once you start to commingle things, it's very hard to break them out and create this separation of which account and which privilege set can do what. So it's much better to create a PHP user with a PHP privilege set with the PHP extended privilege or service, as I think of it, checked, because then you can turn off the PHP account. If all of a sudden you've got something security and you wrote a bad PHP file for accessing the FileMaker data, all you have to do is turn off that one account or that one privilege set or what have you. And the rest of these are here for security as well. You will typically want to check them, to leave these unchecked unless you know that you want them. And that is Apple Events and ActiveX. This was a security hole that FileMaker had where you could write an Apple script on Macintosh and it would be able to access a file. Users didn't know that, and it basically allowed you to get a list of scripts and just run them arbitrarily if you wanted to. So it's good that these are in FileMaker 16. They are not in versions of FileMaker 15 and earlier. So a good security caveat to know is that if your file can be accessed by an older version of FileMaker, say 15, 14, that file can probably still have AppleScript or Apple ActiveX run against it. So we're going to see in a future video where you can control that in the file settings. You can determine that a user has to have a certain version, and it's only with 16 and higher that you have these limitations of some of these security holes with ActiveX, Apple Events, URLs, and so forth, and our new data API, which we'll get into way, if ever. If you want to, you can look at videos on the FileMaker Magazine site with regards to that. So all of these extended privileges are things that you set onto a privilege set, a la a role, and when that person logs in, the role or the privilege set is used in order to determine what that person can do. My final little tidbit before we get to the chat and questions is, why is the extended privileges here exposed? Well, you can actually, what's interesting, I just noticed, it used to be that FileMaker had those brackets, just like the brackets that we saw on the default accounts. FileMaker used to have the brackets on these, but in FileMaker 16, it looks like they removed them. FileMaker's always moving forward and changing things. But what's cool is you can create your own extended privileges. Now, this is an advanced technique to do, but the cool thing is, you can create an extended privilege, which when you put that on a privilege set, works across multiple privilege sets. So for example, I'm creating a set here, or a keyword of an extended privilege of access customer data. And I'm going to put whether, if I could spell that, a user can access customer data. Now, this is where you get to, basically, it comes into play when you're an advanced FileMaker developer and in your scripts or in the security settings where that limited was that we saw, you can actually say, does the privilege set that the current logged in user have, doesn't have the extended privilege of access customer data. If it does, then you can let them edit the record or view the record or what have you. And the advantage here with an extended privilege is that you can apply this to multiple privilege sets. So you can see that as I check this on, I can say in my programming, when I'm programming, if the user has the extended privilege of access customer data, then let's go ahead and let them edit the data. This is one step beyond what we just took a look at, which was saying if this account name matches who created it, they can edit the data. Well, if you want to shift that a higher level and allow multiple privilege sets, let's say managers and data entry people to do that, you can do it with an extended privilege. And unfortunately, this is just one of the underused areas because it's so hidden and was obscure within the world of FileMaker that a lot of FileMaker developers, at least new developers and intermediate, almost never use it from the standpoint of how can I control access to my data. And if you can do it with an extended privilege and apply that across multiple privileges, many times it's easier to get what you're looking for when you're dealing with privileges. So I know that some of this stuff may seem abstract, but I think I've done a pretty thorough job of explaining the managed security area of FileMaker. And of course, there are so many different things that you can do with this, and it ties into FileMaker's calculation engine. I've gone a little bit long, and I want to get to our chat, so let me switch to that really quickly, see if we've got anybody coming in with questions. I've only got one so far, but man, am I explaining things so well? I must be. We've got just a few people here. It's a Friday, so I don't expect there'll be that many people. But here's the question. Can you use a combination of authentication types? You cannot use a combination of authentication types. It is either one or the other. So it's the FileMaker file, or it's external authentication, or it's one of the three of the third-party services, or more if FileMaker adds on more to the system in terms of being able to do that. And yeah, that's pretty much what you have in terms of authentication. One thing I will suggest that if you can take the time, if you're interested in becoming an advanced FileMaker developer, or you're moving from the intermediate to the advanced level, set aside some time and take the time to invest in learning and using external authentication. In particular, the Active Directory. That really makes it worthwhile, because what happens is when a user logs in through external authentication, you get to control it in one single place for multiple files, rather than having to do that song and dance of putting the same usernames and accounts from one file to the next. Now, we haven't even looked at connecting multiple files. We will be doing that. One thing I will leave you with here with regards to authentication and the way that it does work, a given FileMaker file passes its username and whether or not it's authenticated from one file to another file. So in other words, if you have multiple FileMaker files connected together, once a user logs into one file with a valid username and password, when that one file attempts to interact with another file, let's say show data from that other file, or call a script in that other file and have it do something, if the other file, if file B, has the same username and password, FileMaker considers that good. It doesn't authenticate for each and every file. It simply authenticates on, is this user who they say they are based on their password? And then if so, okay, the other file has the same credentials, go ahead and just let them do that in that other file as well. And so that's a key thing to know about FileMaker's authentication system. So I think that's probably going to give this video a wrap. I went a little long here, 43, but I've had other videos that have gone that long. If you've checked in here on the videos and you're watching this after the fact, after the live stream, and you've got questions, feel free to put it down in the comments below. If there are things that you would like to see me cover throughout this series, please add that as well. Also, as you're watching this video, if you're interested in being notified when I'm going to start my new live stream, if you're using the YouTube mobile app or what have you, you can actually click the subscribe button, which will either come up here or here. It's basically my little logo or icon. And if you're interested in the next video in this series, it will show up probably on either side here as well. So having said that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending, and much luck with your FileMaker database. And until next time, happy file making. All right.